any more comments or questions to
I think it was Dominique that said, mentioned Karl Marx's analysis of the situation. I think he also pointed out that slavery was actually an advance type of society on the prior society to that, which was a sort of hunter-gathering society, basic communism. And I think he also pointed out that slavery, the slave society, was a necessary and inevitable development of society from primitive communism through slavery into feudalism, capitalism, then socialism, communism. He saw it as a whole progression. It was absolutely inevitable. If you look back to the old Roman slavery, which was it was a very, very, very stable empire, almost static. It was a highly productive empire. It was based on slavery. And it was actually an improvement overall, both for the owners and ultimately the slaves themselves. They all were better off because of slavery than the old hunter-gathering system before that. And just to concur, the biggest abolitionist, of course, wasn't the moral middle class who, saw it as a moral issue. It was very likely in this country the British working class who experienced that outmoded form of production because people were working essentially for free, just for the food and water, were actually undermining their wages. Rallied against slavery.
I'd just like to say something briefly in response to that. The fact is that, yes, slavery has been around and is still around for a long, long time, but we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, which was something entirely different. In Africa, they did have slaves. If they went to war with a different tribe, they took people on and they had them as slaves. These slaves could become chiefs. These slaves were educated in the place of the chief's own sons. These slaves could actually live a full and fruitful life. In the transatlantic slave trade, that was not so. So I don't think that we can kind of confuse the issue in any way in that some slavery was good, but other wasn't, because slavery is never good, no matter how good it is for economics.
That's what I wanted to add in terms of, slavery is really complicated because you have different, especially in the history of slavery, different forms of slavery. And sometimes I think we should consider the word oppression as well, and systems and ways of oppressing people. And there's a danger where when looking at the Roman Empire and at the type of society it was, to idolize certain forms of slavery. But actually the Roman Empire was not that good when you look at it in that fair, and slaves as well suffered, and other members of the Roman society. But what I mean to say is that we probably need to spend more time in terms of defining slavery and understanding the history of slavery within different systems, within history. Yes, like the world we live in is based, I think, in many ways on slavery, and has been for a long time. But it's a really complex history. I don't know if I'm clear.
I think it's important. I agree with my colleagues here about sort of defining different kinds of slavery. And I think it's very important to see transatlantic slavery as actually beckoning in modernism and modernity. And that's part of the way in which it's very important. In that, in the Caribbean, in particular, but also in the southern states to an extent, but in the Caribbean in particular, 24-hour working was started because of at harvest time for 2 or 3 months as a means of you had to get that harvest in, it had to be done, and also basic early factories were set up as well. So that in fact you could see this slavery as being a kind of crucible for the Industrial Revolution, which was to come later. And that, in fact, some of the ways in which the Industrial Revolution worked in terms of using its labour, in terms of shift working, in terms of loads of different ways, actually started in the Caribbean. So that when we talk about slavery, we shouldn't always talk about it in terms of, Marx is a great man, he's got a lot to say, but, he's very schematic. Things aren't quite as schematic as that. Slavery was an ancient form, yes, and it's a form which took us from hunter-gathering, and it's the next form, maybe, yes. But by this time, by the 18th century, and in its use in the Caribbean in particular, it actually is a very important lead-in to modernity and to the Industrial Revolution. So that, in fact, I wouldn't use Marx's schemata for discussing the plantations, really, because it's flawed in that way in particular. He didn't talk about it as being an industrial process in that way, which I think, and most Marxist historians since Marx have actually talked about it in those terms. People like Robin Blackburn, for instance.
But don't you think it could be used for us to have a better understanding of, let's say, our local heritage and the working class and understanding because you were talking about modern times and industrialization, and how actually people were used as machines, yeah. and to understand as well how capital was made, and even in terms of the hours that workers were working. And I think that's what Marx is really important, and as well in the sense that he recorded a history that was destroyed, and I'm talking now about the working class history. And when I say working class, it's in the broad sense, workers that were used for specific means, and whole areas were changed in the name of capitalism. And it was quite interesting that people like Marx and Engels recorded bits of that history. And this influenced as well other workers around the world, and later on it influenced as well decolonization. I mean, the fight against colonialism in Africa, and the key Marxists actually, like C.L.R. James, and it's quite interesting to see the connections.